My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Dick, the 1999 teen comedy about Watergate.
Max, call the cops. Looks like we got a break in here.
There lives in Watergate. They were there the night of the break-in.
They know anything?
Sir, I have met yams with more going on upstairs than those two.
I'll take care of it. I've got a way with young people. They trust me. They knew he was big. Call me Dick.
Guess what happened to us today?
They knew he was powerful. How would you two be interested in being official White House dog walkers? What do you think?
I'm Gary Holmes, and I'm here with Jim Robinson, who just craves a good graham cracker cookie with chopped walnuts and oregano. Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Gary. I've never tried those. I do confess to trying Alice B. Toklas's hash brownies that were featured in her 1954 cookbook. Tried those once, but you've sort of cracked an inside joke here for people that haven't seen the movie. Believe me, listeners, you will understand the meaning of Gary's joke as we go on.
Okay. So this is only our third podcast and already the second Nixon movie. So can you tell the people why we are doing a Nixon movie again already?
Well, because it's such a counterbalance to the dark and, as you called it, the horror film aspects of the first one we did, the 1995 picture called Nixon by Oliver Stone. I do get, Gary, at the beginning, I do think we need a disclaimer. We are very fond of keeping our podcast G-rated, and we will continue to do that going forward. But there is no way in the world that we can do a podcast on a movie called Dick without at least getting PG rated. The plays on that word, the more than one meaning of that word, are inevitably milked in this film to great comedic effect. So we've got to get into that a little bit.
All right. Well, now I've watched this movie 3 or 4 times before this. And I think I remember that I'm the one that showed it to you the last time you visited our house, which was a long time ago, by the way. So you are due to come see us again sometime. I even have it on DVD, which is how I watched it again.
Wow, you're so cheap. I'm surprised you actually bought the DVD.
We have several DVDs. I am cheap, and we have several DVDs of our favorite movies. But I got to tell you that it was not a pretty sight watching me try and run a DVD machine again. So but I will say I was able to play. One advantage of having the DVD is I could play the director's commentary. So I have a lot of special insight that isn't available on Wikipedia, which is where we usually do our research.
Well, if you can't trust Wikipedia, who can you trust?
So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to put all my cards on the table. Dick is one of our family favorites here. Obviously, we bought the DVD, and it's one of my top 5 comedies, which I am going to tell you my other 4. So it's Dick, Animal House, The Producers, The Big Lebowski, and The Life of Brian. Do you have 5 comedies that you like, Jim?
Well, I do, and we don't coincide, not even once. Although I really liked this movie, but my favorite are Spinal Tap.
Okay, right.
Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, which I watch every year and howl in laughter every Christmas. Harold and Maude from the early 70s, and Office Space from 1999.
Okay, so I would definitely put Office Space and Spinal Tap, and also Napoleon Dynamite in my runners up. It's tough to narrow it down.
Well, I usually tend, when it comes to comedy, I usually go for the more crass and scatological films. Although the famous scene in Blazing Saddles was too much even for me.
You can tell we've stated from the beginning this movie is completely unlike Nixon and Lincoln. Not only are those 2 movies dramas, but anyone who was paying attention in high school class knows the broad outlines of those movies. By contrast, Dick creates an alternative history of some of the most perplexing questions about Watergate. So, Jim, share that alternative history with us. What's this movie about?
Well, it's the story of two teenage girls, Betsy, played by Kirsten Dunst, and Arlene, played by multiple Oscar nominee and never winner Michelle Williams, who by accident find themselves at the center of the Watergate scandal and then the Nixon White House. Arlene and her mom live at the Watergate. So one night the girls were slipping out to mail a letter to Bobby Sherman, a teen idol of the time. And they wanted to get back into the apartment without disturbing mom. So they taped the door open to the Watergate. And not only do they come face to face with some of the Watergate burglars at that moment, they actually caused the capture of the Watergate burglars because of the way they taped the door. So the White House finds out that the girls saw something, and they invite the girls in. They try to co-opt the girls, and they hire them to walk Nixon's dog. And they become frequent visitors to the White House. And in the course of all this, they not only witness history, they make history. They're the reason we had peace in Vietnam. They're the reason Brezhnev and Nixon signed an arms limitation agreement. They're the reason why Nixon adopted his trademark double V wave of the hands. And it's all done with the help of the marijuana cookies that you mentioned, which turns on everyone in the White House, from the guards to the president to Brezhnev. And so I think listeners can get the idea of both the absurdity of this and the hilarity of it. Now, in the course of all this, Arlene really falls for Nixon hard. She becomes a sort of teen smitten, love crushed girl over Nixon. And then disillusionment sets in at some point. They hear a tape of Nixon being mean to his dog. They hear Nixon saying some anti-Semitic things, and they hear that he's involved in Watergate. So the love affair is over. And from that point on, the girls start tattling their tales to Woodward and Bernstein. And their combined actions lead to the exposure of Nixon and the resignation. And in the finally iconic scene where they got what they wanted, Nixon being chased out of town, and they unfurl a sort of obscene banner with one of those plays on the title of the movie that I suggested. And Nixon gives them the finger, and off they go, off he goes into the sunset.
So I will tell you, Jim, that according to the director's cut, Dan Hedaya gave the finger on his own. That was not in the script.
Oh, really?
That was one of the actor's choices. It's a bit of a cult classic now, but it was a bomb back in 1999. It grossed $6.3 million and was the 161st most popular movie that year. So to put that in perspective, the top movies of 1999 were Star Wars, The Phantom Menace. It had a domestic box office of 430. Again, that compares to 6.3. Followed by The Sixth Sense, Austin Powers, Toy Story 2, and The Matrix. And needless to say, there were 0 Academy Award nominations, not even for Michelle Williams, who is now a lifetime loser after Sunday's Academy Awards.
Well, she shouldn't worry, because she'll be nominated 6, 7 more times, and then when she's old, she'll get an honorary Oscar.
Right.
So, if patterns hold. You're the film expert, Gary. How come Nixon films don't make money? I mean, I was looking, and All the President's Men made money. Frost Nixon, or Nixon Frost, made a smidgen of money, just barely. And the Elvis and Nixon movie lost money. Oliver Stone's Nixon movie lost money. How come audiences aren't flocking to theaters to see Richard Nixon movies?
I know I can't understand why people are not dying to go see this extremely charismatic person who resigned in disgrace and goes down as what many people think of as the worst presidents in history. I don't understand why they're not going to these movies.
Well, he was such a funny guy too. I
I
mean,
know it was
you know, I
hilarious.
mean,
It was hilarious in this movie. I don't know why. Anyway, so as we discussed, we've both seen this movie before. Have you seen it since the first time you saw it in my house?
I did watch it last week. I didn't hear the director's cut.
Yeah.
I rented it on Amazon, which gives you one viewing and you can't go back to it. So call that the second time. I've forgotten most of it,
Yeah.
but I was rolling in laughter the whole time.
So we both we go in with certain expectations. What surprised you about the movie? What's
Well,
one?
probably the biggest thing is that, and maybe this is why the movie bombed, you really have to know a lot about Watergate and all the minutia of the Nixon White House to appreciate the jokes.
Right.
And the movie is the jokes are conveyed through one-liners, through Saturday Night Live type skits, through simple situations with no lines that are funny. And there are so many insider references to all the things, all the folklore surrounding Watergate and Nixon, that I just can't imagine how audiences in 1999, which is 25 years later, especially teenage girls in 1999, to whom the movie and the marketing was directed, I just can't imagine how they would get most of it.
Well, I think the inside, and you're right. And I made a long list of these, which I will share later. I think the inside jokes are what make it so hilarious to you, me, my wife,
Right.
people who lived through it and who are Watergate junkies. I mean, you mentioned one already. Well, instead of taping the door down
Vertically.
vertically, they tape it horizontally so that the guard sees the tape. Now that was how the Watergate was discovered because they taped it the wrong way. A little bit of a new, and of course we all laugh, ha ha ha. So that's how that happened. You know, it was the girls. So right, inside jokes. I got to tell you that it was whenever you watch a favorite comedy, there's always a nagging fear it's not really as good when you watch it again. And so I was surprised, to be honest with you, that it still held up. Did you think it was still funny?
Oh, I thought it was funnier because I just don't remember much about the first viewing. It really does hold up, and it held up so much that over the last few days, I went back to read some of the Watergate, books that I've read 4 or 5 times already, just to, revel in it once again because it really was hilarious. Another thing that really surprised me, I don't know why, but it did, is this movie is so seeped in the 1970s. It just evokes what was, in my mind, sort of a schlocky, embarrassing decade. And it was our decade. I mean, this is when we were in college and came into adulthood. And it was so garish and uncool compared to the 60s, maybe the 80s. And we had to suffer through the 70s. And this movie evokes all of that, particularly with the music.
Yeah, the music, the soundtrack. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, anyone who likes 70s music will love this movie.
The soundtrack is fantastic. I mean, that was a surprise for me that it was so good. And I completely agree with you that it evokes the 70s. And I mean, we can get into this later. I don't know if we're going to do it a compare and contrast, but I felt this was more representative of the 70s than the Oliver Stone Nixon movie. I felt like this is how I remember living through the I mean, between the clothes and the music and the Bobby Sherman posters and all of that. Another thing that surprised me, I was surprised to see Ryan Reynolds in this movie. He's a huge star now, thanks to superhero movies like Deadpool, Green Lantern and rom-coms like The Proposal. And he's a big, major star. And he was only 23 in this movie, but he looks a lot younger. So, and the
Yeah.
cast in general was a big surprise. Like, oh, that person's in it. That person's in
Right. Well, Ryan Reynolds does a good burp.
it.
In his scene, he's guzzling out of a beer bong.
I will,
And,
according to the director's cut, Ryan Reynolds had to do that scene like 50 times, and every time he hit the burp exactly right. Destined for greatness. Destined for greatness.
That's an Oscar-winning performance. Better than Blazing Saddles. The other thing that surprised me, and I was really glad to be surprised by this, a movie like this in the hands of, and I'm just speculating,
Yeah.
in the hands of left-wing people can be preachy, pedantic, all one-sided. You know, one guy's the villain, another guy's the hero, even in comedy. This movie was as much a takedown of the Washington Post
Right.
and of All the President's Men, that film, as it was about Nixon. I mean, they just reamed Woodward and Bernstein.
Well, it is actually a spoof of All the President's Men, in addition to being a spoof about Nixon. Absolutely, and those guys are made to look ridiculous. Exactly, and that was also a surprise. In the director's cut, I promise not to say this every time, but in the director's cut, the director does admit that it is hard. It was a lot harder to make Woodward and Bernstein funny because they were basically sacred cows at that point. I mean, the culture has built them up as some sort of superheroes.
Right, and I thought some of the scenes making fun of All the President's Men movie
Right.
were really spot on. I'm remembering when they were showing their story to Ben Bradley. And Ben Bradley, by the way, played by the actor who famously played Senator Pat Geary in Godfather Part 2. That scene was almost an identical depiction of the scene in the movie where Bradley propping one of his legs up on the desk and acting pompous and tough talking all at the same time. It was really well done.
Well, the very first scene in the movie is, the very, very first scene is the two of them being interviewed about who Deep Throat is, and they're like slapping each other because Carl Bernstein almost lets the cat out of the bag who Deep Throat is. But the second scene is a typewriter like trying to type a letter to Bobby Sherman, and that's the direct call out to the beginning of All the President's Men, which is a typewriter typing in the story about Watergate. So yeah.
Well, I'm sure we'll do a podcast someday on All the President's Men.
Yeah.
But it's really good tonic for me to see this movie and its takedown of them first.
Right. Okay, so the director, Andrew Fleming, completely unknown to me. He directed a handful of unsuccessful comedies, such as an In-Laws remake, Nancy Drew, Hamlet 2. None of these movies I've seen or really have a desire to see. What do you think he and his screenwriters were trying to accomplish here?
Well, I think it's supposedly to remind the American people that through humor, that Nixon was a creep and a louse. I think that was one of the intentions. I read, and I'm only presuming this is true, maybe you can mention the director's commentary one more time if you want. Supposedly the filmmaker and the screenwriter were a little bit troubled by Nixon's ongoing redemption, by the revisionist history that was greeting Nixon, by his comeback, if you will. And this movie was made about 5 years after he died. But he was out of office. He lived for 20 years between his resignation in 74 and his death in 94, and did become something of a prolific writer, elder statesman, somebody who was sought after, and somebody who over time was looked at in a broader context than Watergate. So I think that my theory is that they wanted to remind people why Nixon deserved to be something of a creepy, villainous kind of figure. And they were also operating from the knowledge, the very current knowledge at the time, that a president that they probably liked, again, I'm just speculating, Bill Clinton, had just been impeached. And Nixon actually was never impeached. He
Right.
resigned before he could be.
Well, he was impeached also for having illicit relations with a teenager, not 15 years old, but
Well,
maybe
early 20s, but
early 20s. All right.
an
Well,
employee.
an employee, right. So, I mean, I couldn't help but think of Clinton during some of these scenes where, Arlene was, dreaming about her relationship with the president, right? I mean, dreaming that he was going to leave Pat for her. And then, it was the same with Monica. Monica Lewinsky thought that Clinton was going to leave, Hillary.
Right. And presidents, and I guess everyone else will never learn, somebody's always taping you. Always.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I agree with you. I agree with you that he didn't really succeed in undermining Nixon's comeback. It's really hard to do that in a comedy. Rita Kempley of the Washington Post said, for example, that the creators are, quote, rather fond of their executive monster. And I think that's exactly what happened. I mean, he's not really a bad guy in this movie. He's kind of a joke, except for there is one hateful episode, which is after the girls have listened to the tapes and they confront him about mean to the dog. He loses his temper. He throws their background dossiers on the desk. And when Michelle Williams, Arlene, asks whether it says who her father is, he dismissively and cruelly reports that he was a 24-year-old shoe salesman at Garfinkel's, got hit by a car. So she's been dreaming about who her father is and all the rest. And that's part of the reason she has a crush on Dick, who's an older guy. And that destroys the dream. So that's actually the
That's
one
downright cruel.
that was the only one mean thing that happened in the movie. But otherwise, he's somewhat sympathetic. I mean, they
Yeah.
don't kid around about his role in Watergate. It's very blatant. Like he says, all I asked for was a simple bugging, and
Well, I think
so
I think it would be helpful in a few seconds to maybe review the rehabilitation that had been going on
sure.
for listeners. As I said, Nixon wrote 8 books. He was sought after as a foreign policy expert. He traveled the world. He met with the top leaders. He was an intermediary in some back channel negotiations between the current US presidents of the time and things going on with the Soviet Union, with Yeltsin, with Gorbachev, and of course in China. He, in the early 90s, a book came out by 2 conservative leaning journalists called The Silent Coup, which presented a whole alternative history, speaking of all alternative histories, of Watergate, saying that it was really Dean behind most of it, and that Nixon was duped into a lot of his own wrongdoing. He Pat Nixon died in 1993, and there was a funeral where Nixon was openly weeping, and those images were flashed all over, the world, and it was a sympathetic depiction of him. When he died in 94, Bill Clinton, a Democrat, with Hillary, a former staff person to the impeachment committee, sitting in the audience, was fulsome in his praise and said, let the day end when Richard Nixon is not judged by the totality of his career. So this had been going on for some time.
Well,
And I think that's what was working here.
Well, the other thing that happens, of course, and we've talked about this before, is that every time there's a new Republican president, the previous Republican president doesn't look so bad. So after Reagan, who was at that point the worst Republican president ever, Nixon looked good because,
Right.
he had created the EPA and he'd done, wage and price controls and he'd done this and that and the other thing that all these liberals liked. He even, I remember Tom Wicker, who was an extreme New York Times critic of Nixon, wrote a book talking about, well, maybe we really had kind of got that guy wrong because he was big on urban renewal and he's spent a lot of money on this thing, all this and the other. So,
Yeah, well, all Republican presidents go through their Hitler phase,
right.
when they're Hitler or worse than Hitler. And now we're even doing it prospectively, and not we, the media and others, calling prospective presidents worse than Hitler. So you're right about that. You and I had our own exposure somewhat to the
Yeah, we
Nixon
we both
comeback and
partic
rehabilitation,
Yeah,
didn't
we
we?
both participated in the rehabilitation campaign. So you go first. Tell your story.
Well, I was working for the governor of California in the 1980s, George Deukmejian, and I think it was 86 or 87. We had a Republican Governors Association meeting, and it was chaired by Governor Tom Kean of New Jersey. So we had the meeting in New Jersey, and we went to a special meeting where Richard Nixon was the guest. And Nixon did like he famously did, stood before the small audience, hands clasped behind his back, and without a single note, took us around the world with insights about everything going on in every major relationship and every major hotspot in the world. And it was just remarkable. It was astounding. And then afterward, we each got to get in line and greet him personally, get our picture taken, and have maybe 1 or 2 minutes of private conversation. And I did. I was lucky enough to be able to do that. And I mentioned that I was out in California working for the governor, and Nixon immediately launched into some minutia about California politics, some of which I didn't even know. So I think that anybody in that audience who maybe a decade earlier would not even want to be seen with Nixon were sort of awestruck. And that was sort of part of the image he was able to create.
Well, my story is earlier than that. It was 1980. So this is 6 years after he resigned, and I was a reporter on Nantucket Island, and this is all covered in my memoir, Unfortunate Son, which is available for sale on Amazon, by the way. So I was on Nantucket, and Nixon and Bibi Rebozo showed up on Nantucket one day in Robert Alplanop's yacht. Alplanop was Nixon's second best friend. And they came onto the wharf and walked around. And I learned then that people love celebrities. Nixon was a celebrity, but here he is in a Republican and Democratic Nantucket, and people were swarming around him. I mean, a lot of these people were tourists, but they were swarming around him and like I couldn't wait to talk to him and to have the picture taken with him and all that kind of stuff. So then he goes off. He went off on a ride around the island, and we caught up with him. The reporters caught up with him at the other end of the island when he got out of the car to walk around. And sure enough, all he wanted to talk about was sports. Oh, the Red Sox are, never have much pitching. So, this is his small talk. And he was, you know, very uh, fancy dressed, completely inappropriate for walking along the beach. And he was, he was pleasant enough. And then he went out for dinner that night. My sources told me that he bought an expensive bottle of wine that Bibi Rebozo paid for, and then he left and never came back. So, you know, people were really reacting surprisingly favorably to having Nixon walk around and, just strolling around like normal.
Well, I don't know if I told you this, but I'm not sure if this is still true, but maybe a year or so ago, I Googled Nixon to look at the various pictures of him through the years. And, they always put up a big library of photos.
Yeah.
Um, and a picture of you and Nixon was in that library.
What?
Now, I don't know if that's because some internet gremlin knew that your name was on
Right.
my address book and
Right.
all that.
Right.
But and the caption didn't even identify you.
Okay.
But there was you and Nixon. Did that picture get published anywhere?
I did publish it. It was published in the local newspaper, the Inquirer and Mirror. So this is a challenge to all our millions of listeners to Google Nixon Nantucket to see what pictures come up, and let us know if it's just Jim's search history that results in this, or if it's a natural thing.
Yeah, if anyone's really interested in what Nixon and Pat were like during the 20 years between the resignation and their deaths, there's a great little book. It's not a heavy read. It's called After the Fall, The Remarkable Comeback of Richard Nixon by Casey Pipes, Pipes. And it's kind of favorable, but he was given access to all the private papers post resignation, which are controlled by the Nixon family. They're not controlled by the government, and including Nixon and Tricia Nixon's personal diaries. If anyone's as interested as we are, it's an interesting book. Not quite as good as your memoir, Gary, which I
I
also
was gonna
recommend.
say you're endorsing a book by someone we don't even know, and like we got to plug my book.
Yeah, I know the gratitude.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the actors for a second. This is where we usually talk about best impersonations and worst impersonations. There's only really one legitimate impersonation here, and that's Dan Hedaya as Nixon. He was the dad in Clueless, and more famous to me is Carla's ex-husband, Nick Tortelli, in Cheers. Um, I thought he was great. What did you think?
I did too, and I was I had to keep myself from saying to myself, he's better than Anthony Hopkins.
Right.
Because that's not really fair. Because all Dan Hedaya had to do, no small feat, but was do comedy, do parody. Whereas Hopkins had to portray Nixon in a lot of very serious scenes and conveying serious thoughts and ideas. But I thought he was super. His voice was great. His 5 o'clock shadow was great. The hunched up shoulders with the loose fitting suit, was perfect mimicry of Nixon. I just thought he did a super job.
Well, I think that I think he did a good job too, and I would say he was equal to the Oliver Stone Nixon. I think the real Nixon falls somewhere in between these two Nixons. I mean, one is in the other one, he's haunted. He's sour all the time. I mean, he's serious. I'm sure that Nixon enjoyed life a little bit more than you'd have seen in the Oliver Stone movie, but maybe not as much as in this movie. I think it's probably unlikely that he ever had all those marijuana cookies in the Oval Office, for example. So
Well,
that's
do
probably,
you really think that's unlikely?
that was such a funny. Everything about those cookies was hilarious. All right, I also thought that Dave Foley's crew cut was a good imitation of H.R. Haldeman's. Dave Foley
Yes,
is
and
one.
I thought his eyes looked more like Haldeman's than James Woods.
Yeah,
So I thought he was a little young and boyish,
yeah.
although Haldeman wasn't that old then, but he was kind of young. But I thought Yeah, the hair and the eyes
Well,
looked like Nixon, looked like Haldeman to me.
yeah, the real problem is that we know Dave Foley from News Radio, that this TV show, and he played a very young person on there, and I'm with you. He just didn't seem substantive enough. I mean, it's possible that he's entirely the same height, the same weight, and everything, but he just seemed a lightweight compared to be playing Haldeman. I thought Harry Shearer's mustache was a good imitation of G. Gordon Liddy.
Yeah, I liked him. He wasn't in it that much,
No, he wasn't in
but
that.
but he played the sort of maniacal, semi-fascist, crazed, tough guy pretty well.
Of course, you could
He's had
buy.
an interesting career.
Okay, yes, he has.
He,
Since go
he
ahead.
was in Spinal Tap.
That's
He
right.
was
He was.
Derek Smalls, the bass player, who famously stuffed a cucumber down his pants before going on stage. And and then in a bit of trivia, he was the original Eddie Haskell on Leave It to Beaver. Now he wasn't called Eddie Haskell, but in the pilot episode for Leave It to Beaver, where they had a different Wally and a different Ward Cleaver, they had a different troublemaker, and it was played by Harry Shearer.
Okay, that is excellent trivia. I'm gonna have to check that out. Of
What, don't
course,
you believe me?
no, I want to see what it's like. I definitely want to see. That sounds fascinating. He's actually very famous though, behind the scenes because he's most famous and most richest from being the voice actor on The
Mhm.
Simpsons. He plays Mr. Burns, Ned Flanders. At one point, he was making $500,000 an episode, and then he threatened to go on strike when the salary was cut to $300,000 an episode. So, like, no, $300,000 for a day's work is not enough. I'm going to quit.
Things are tough all over.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, I think that they called his bluff on that, and he decided that $300,000, he could spend that day doing that work. Um, I was surprised to see Will Farrell playing Bob Woodward.
Yeah, it was very strange to see him play the straight man, basically.
Right.
And I thought he was, you know, I'm sure the Bernstein depiction will be more of a fan favorite. You needed the straight man there to play off of the over the top Bernstein, but um, I didn't think he was that funny, but I'm not sure he was meant to be that funny compared to his partner.
Well, the two of them together are funny, like you say.
Yes.
The straight man, the other guy, who I'm not familiar with him, but I guess he's a comedian. It's funny when you look at the credits on the movie and in this trailer and on the box. Will Farrell is like five or six people down. He's under Dave Foley and Harry Shearer, and he's a gigantic movie star too. I mean, he was in Elf, Christmas movie that I watch every year. Old school Anchorman, Telehagen Nights. I mean, he's a major star up there with Ryan Reynolds. So the two of those guys are the biggest stars in this movie, except for the girls. And they have very low billing.
Now, maybe I can ask you a question. Why can't anyone play John Dean properly?
Right. That is I don't know.
Because we were talking during our Nixon movie podcast that we didn't care for that portrayal. And I didn't care for this one. I just think it must be really hard to capture John Dean, either seriously or comedically.
Part of the problem is that in both those movies, both Nixon and this movie, he's an advisor. He's involved. And he's such a milquetoast personality himself that it's hard to parody, I suppose, but they can never get the right thing about him. I don't know. I mean, he's someone that's like the liberals consider a little bit of a weasel, and we consider a complete weasel. And so he falls in between. But I agree with you. Now the guy
I,
Saul Rubinek, who plays Henry Kissinger, um, again in the Nixon movie, he was what little bit of like humorous relief there was Kissinger, and in this movie, I think he's extremely humorous character.
yes, I thought again, he wasn't in it that much, but he had some memorable, lines and scenes. I mean, right down to the showing a little too much interest in the two young girls and,
That's right.
and so forth. So, yeah, I
I'm gonna,
thought he was good.
yeah, I'm gonna give you my four best line. I mean, I would
Well,
normally save this for best lines, but he just like is knocking them off one by one. So he's coming down the staircase and he says to his aides, "Make sure the photographers are outside the restaurant after lunch." Right. So that's an inside joke because we all know what a publicity hound Kissinger was. Then he says to the guards when he takes the girls, he says, "I'll take responsibility. I'm the only one around here who will take responsibility for anything." And then when he's talking about getting out of Vietnam, he says, "You have to remember that it took Charles de Gaulle 4 years to get out of Algeria," which to me was one of the funniest lines because he's talking to these 15-year-old girls like he's talking to some graduate student in Harvard, and that he was always taking these big geopolitical analysis, and then finally at the end, he's like, when he delivers the girls to Nixon, and Nixon doesn't invite him in, he's like, "Well, I'm late for a meeting anyway with the Nobel Committee." You know, so it shows.
Yeah,
He's portrayed as an egomaniac and a publicity hound and all that.
right, right. Well, I'll save my favorite lines for later, but don't forget to ask me.
Okay, I won't. It's on my
Well,
list.
what about the two lead characters?
Wait, just one more.
Oh,
I'm
we're
gonna
gonna
say
do
this
another.
'cause
Wait. Okay.
wait. I know I can't stop us. And this is why our podcasts are always 4 hours long because I keep saying one more thing. Um, and this comes from the only reason I'm mentioning this because I got some insight from the director's commentary. Anna Gasteyer is Rosemary Woods. Obviously, nothing like her. She was a very sedate, and she's a little bit of a caricature, but the director said that they would have made her funnier, except that she threatened to sue, which is similar to what you said about the Nixon movie. I mean, a lot of the characters in there threatened to sue, and Oliver Stone went easier on them.
Yeah, I think that's an issue with these biopics that portray living people that are still alive, and so it's going to be an issue.
All right, let's talk
Um,
about the girls.
well, no, I've got one more thing.
Okay. Well, now you're the one with the
Just
one more thing. All right. I
um,
gotta have lunch sometime today.
Bruce McCullough, his
Okay.
hair,
Yeah. Oh,
the
yeah, that's right.
hair,
Yeah.
Carl Bernstein's hair was the single best imitation in the movie.
Right. Right. He was flipping it all the time. Yeah, that was very funny. And it was also funny
Right.
that they made him so short. I mean, not that made him, he is short compared to compared to Will Ferrell. So there's actually a problem for the cinematographers to get them in the same shot because one was so tall and one was so short.
Hmm.
Okay, Michelle Williams.
Yeah, I thought both of the two leads, both
Yeah.
young women, were very good. They were very appealing. They didn't annoy me or grate on my nerves. And let's face it, for older guys watching teenage girls in movies, that's a gold star right there. But I thought Michelle Williams had the harder part to play. She had to undergo a transformation. She was kind of a gawky, insecure, geek kind of a person who then underwent a metamorphosis to an attractive young woman who was starstruck and who was love struck. Never mind that her love interest was Richard M. Nixon. And then she had to change once again when she became disillusioned. So I thought she had the tougher, more complex part.
Yeah, I really thought when I looked at it again and watched it closely that she's incredible. I mean, she's 19 at the time. I really believe that she was 15. She did a great job of depicting the dead serious silliness of teen love and the heightened emotions. I mean, she was uh, you could uh, you could believe her as really feeling that and not being ridiculous. And I felt, sorry for her. She's been, as we said, she's been nominated for 5 Oscars for Brokeback Mountain, Marilyn, Blue Valentine, Manchester by the Sea, and most recently for The Fablemans. And I think, to be honest with you, I think she's better in this movie than in those movies.
Oh, really? Yeah.
She's better in this movie than she is in The Fablemans, for example, because it's a very hard role to make her sympathetic and silly and funny. She doesn't have a father. She doesn't know who her father is. The father died, but they believe that she dreams that he's someone else, and that's why this business about her mother being right about him being like a nobody who got killed earlier turns out to be true. But
Well, I know her mainly from Brokeback Mountain. I thought she was good. And then, of course, all the tabloid stuff that swirled around that, because in the course of that film, she fell in love with Heath Ledger. They had a baby. He tragically died. But I also know her from Dawson's Creek on television. She was one of the entourage characters in that series, which I have on DVD, Gary. I sprung for it. And I really enjoyed that back in the day. So unlike Kirsten Dunst, who I understand is a big movie star, but I've never seen her in anything because I haven't seen her movies. I have had more exposure to Michelle Williams.
yeah, and I'll just say one more thing about her. Like last time I talked about how David Stratham who was in the Lincoln movie and played William Seward. I wouldn't recognize him if you walk down the street and he's in all these. Same with Michelle Williams. She is somehow a chameleon who I can barely remember what she was like in Brokeback Mountain. Performance was great. I mean, definitely does a good job of appearing as an entirely different person in each movie. And again, she's someone else. If she walked down the street, I don't think I'd recognize her. And I certainly don't recognize her in this movie as the Michelle Williams of today, whereas Kirsten Dunst really does kind of look the same. And I actually have seen Kirsten Dunst in a few movies, the Spider-Man movies, and she was in the Fargo TV show, and she was great in that. So she's not as big of an actress as she's maybe a bigger star, but not as esteemed an actress.
Right. I think Michelle Williams sort of has made a different career path decision than Kirsten Dunst to alternate between serious, big box office releases to sort of art house from time to time.
All right. Any more actors you want to talk about, or you want to go to the history?
Let's go to the history.
All right. So, obviously, almost all the scenes in this movie are fictional. Yet, as you mentioned, the more you know about the history, the more you appreciate the movie. You have to emphasize that Watergate, I mean, it's 50 years ago now, which I can't believe. But Watergate was the most important political drama between the Kennedy assassination and 9/11. And there's a dying breed of Watergate groupies who know everything about the movie, everything about Watergate. And this movie is really made for them. And as I said, literally a dying breed because we're dying off.
Speak for yourself. Speak for yourself. But you're right.
So you started to talk about the way the girls affected history, and I made a list too. So the tape on the Watergate door, you being the wrong way, resulted in them having the Watergate burglars discovered. They teach Nixon the V sign, the victory for peace. They caused the 18 and a half minute game,
right,
which is almost was one of the they convinced John Dean to regain his conscience and quit. You're right. They break the logjam in the Nixon Brezhnev summit by getting them both high on marijuana cookies. They're the ones who discover the tapes,
Right.
and most importantly, they are Deep Throat. You know, which is they name themselves Deep Throat because Kirsten Dunst's brother has just been caught by his parents watching this porn movie called Deep Throat. So, uh,
Right. And this movie came out before the real identity of Deep
right,
Throat
right,
was
right.
revealed.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I thought what they did was they took they took many real things in the Nixon and the Watergate folklore and just presented an alternate reason why those things happened
right,
or an alternate outgrowth from those things. And there are so many things, the ones you mentioned, but also others that, you know, someone like us watching the movie, we say, yep, that really happened. Nixon walking on the beach with his dress clothes, a suit, and his dress shoes on,
right,
really happened. You know,
right.
those kinds of things. And the explanations are absurd, meant to be, for why these different things happened. But they point to some larger truths.
Right. Large true, which is
Um,
Watergate itself was absurd.
yes, and that there were not only not only absurd conduct. I mean, just the idea of breaking into a party headquarters, which doesn't count for anything in an election that Nixon was going to win in a landslide. Just that was so absurd. The fact that supposedly professional burglars, black bag men would tape the door horizontally and get caught. That was absurd. Um, but the larger truths, in addition to the whole thing was absurd, was the paranoia that surrounded not only Nixon, attributed in the movie partially to the marijuana cookies, but all of Nixon's opponents. I mean, you probably remember the scene in All the President's Men where, you know, somebody said, your lives are in danger to Woodward and Bernstein. No, they weren't.
Right.
You know, I mean, the absurdity of people actually believing those things. And then, probably one of the biggest truths that the movie brings out is that the disillusionment the girls felt for Richard Nixon mirrored the public disillusionment
Right.
that people had with Nixon as more came out about Watergate and about his mannerisms and all that. Nixon's approval was in the high 60s and upper 50s to low 60s through most of his first term. It got up to near 60 during his reelection year. And then as soon as the Watergate stuff started breaking, it just went off a cliff down to 25. So that the movie sort of echoes that.
Well, you're right that it does show you how popular he was, and but also how disconnected a lot of people were from Watergate. I mean, the parents, they're watching him on TV, and you know, they're a little bit indifferent to what's going on until the very end, and it's like, wow, I couldn't believe it when this went all the way up to the top. So yeah, I think I agree with you that there's actually a larger truth here, even though all these other things are so not so ridiculous and hilarious. I
Yeah,
have,
now there are a few things where they just either got the history wrong or deliberately
yeah,
changed it to make their skit or their point. It wasn't Woodward and Bernstein that exposed the tapes.
right, right,
You know, it was the committee investigating
right.
Watergate on Capitol Hill. Nixon didn't press a button to operate the tapes like he did in the movie. They were voice activated, etc. There were things like that.
Yeah, right. I agree that there were a lot of. I mean, the Nixon Brezhnev summit took place in Moscow rather than Washington, I mean, the idea, of course, that the girls would be able to sort of burst in on Nixon Brezhnev. I mean, it's ridiculous, but I mean, this is a comedy, and it's a lot of here is for exaggeration.
Right.
And there's a couple of other references to All the President's Men that I want to talk. There's an idea about meeting in the garage,
Yes.
with them, is true. This whole sequence where they're on the phone with Woodward and Bernstein, and they're distracted, and Woodward and Bernstein are saying, if this is true, I know you can't talk, but if it's true and you don't deny it in the next 10 seconds, we're going to assume that it's true, right? So if you don't deny it in 10 seconds and they count down, and then it turns out not to be true, and they publish the wrong information. I mean, that's a big thing both in the book and in the movie, when
Right.
they do this ridiculous, if it's not true, say something. If it is true, don't say anything. I loved the fact that Woodward is complaining that this mistake that they made him look bad. He says, "I went to Yale," so
Right.
and there's a lot of in jokes too, like the plumber, like the plumber's van that's following them around. The dog, they call the dog Checkers, which the real dog's name was King Timahu. But at one point, Dean says, the dog might like him better if you call him by his real name, King Timahu, instead of Checkers. So
Right. Checkers had probably been dead a number of years by this time.
Checkers
And
been long dead.
yeah, but I think they were having fun with sort of Nixon's relationship with dogs.
Well, that's
the
right.
Checkers being the one that saved his career in 1952, saved him from getting tossed off of the ticket by Eisenhower because he invoked this dog Checkers that they weren't going to give back.
Right. Right.
And so that was, I thought, done to great effect. And we both laughed about the dog theme in Oliver Stone's movie.
Right.
Nixon's even mean to his dog. So yeah, I thought that was funny.
They called him. By the way, when I was on Nantucket and Nixon came off the boat, the one person who was obnoxious to Nixon was yelling, "Where's Checkers? Where's Checkers?" And Nixon walks up to him and says, "Checkers died. Cocker Spaniels don't live long, So, like, okay. Yeah. Also in the Oliver Stone movie, there's a joke in this movie about him being a fan of Guy Lombardo.
Right. I caught that.
And of course they're reading these books, I'm Okay, You're Okay, and another time they're reading Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
And Love American Style comes
Right.
on the TV.
Yes.
It's just seeped in the 70s.
Now there's one joke, I don't know whether this is meant to be a joke, but I picked up on this, and I might be digging deep because I kind of want to be. But when Michelle Williams calls Woodward and Bernstein, she's got a fake British accent, and she claims to be the daughter of the British ambassador. In real life, Carl Bernstein had an affair with the British ambassador's wife while he was married to Nora Ephron, and when she was pregnant. I mean, it's kind of a weird, maybe that's just a coincidence, or maybe they're just sort of sticking it to him, talking about the British ambassador, but whatever.
If you pour your life into writing a screenplay like this, I imagine your mind is just brimming with ideas.
Yeah.
Like that. And some of them you don't even care if the audience gets.
So this kind of reminded me of Watergate, the way we remembered. I mean, they did a lot. I mean, they shot it at the real Watergate, from the real Howard Johnson's across the street, and they were in the very room shooting across to the Watergate. They're in the very room where the plumbers were hiding out that night. So, and apparently, the Howard Johnsons used to charge $100 extra to stay in that room because so many people wanted to stay there. So
I'm glad that was accurate, because didn't they stumble on and Liddy during the opening
Yeah,
parts. And Liddy was never actually at the
yeah,
Watergate,
yeah.
so.
Yeah. Um, another reason this reminded me so much of the 70s, that scene where Arlene and Betsy are giving oral reports to their class. And in one scene, you've got this very severe teacher who's like, how dare you lie about the president like that? And in the other, you've got this black, very groovy, you know, teacher with his huge afro, and there's photos of Angela Davis on the blackboard, and neither
Of
of
course,
them,
that's what all classes are like now, so.
yeah, yeah, neither of them believe her, but they have different responses, right? So
Right.
that schizophrenia between this class and that class was what it was like. I mean, in the 60s at least. By the 70s, I think things had slipped a little bit, but in the 60s, we've talked about this before, how uh things change so fast, and some between the 50s and the 70s there was this moment where things were just in flux, and you could be in one stiff class and one very loose class.
So what were some of your favorite scenes?
Okay. My favorite scene was everything connected to the 818 and a half minute gap.
Yes.
So it famously, this is one mystery, a supposed mystery, although we kind of all have to assume that Nixon actually did go back and erase something very incriminating. But in this movie, the 18-minute and a half gap is caused because when Arlene is in there uh, to walk the dog, they come across the tape recorder, and Betsy, Kirsten Dunst, tells Michelle Williams to tell Dick how you really feel. I mean, let it all out. So she starts singing "I Honestly Love You," uh, which was uh, hilarious. And then she goes on this long, long monologue about how she really loves him and yada, yada, yada. And when Kristen Dunst comes back, she's like, I've been gone 18 and a half minutes. You've been talking the whole time. So,
That was great. That
and
was
then
just great.
later when Nixon's listening to the tapes and he hears this, he's like horrified that this girl is like, so he goes and erases the whole thing. So that was
Right.
my,
Never mind about blackmail, bugging,
right. It's just
abuse of power.
embarrassment. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a shadow of some truth in that. Supposedly one of Nixon's big issues in releasing tapes was his profanity,
Right.
more than the conduct that he was discussing on the tapes.
All right. What was your
That
favorite?
was a good one. Some of them were just little snippet vignettes that I found so hilarious that don't even translate well to when you try to explain them. But there was one scene where I'm going to laugh, where Pat Nixon, who didn't really figure
Right.
much in this movie, was in bed snoring while Nixon was on the phone or something. And just for no reason, they just suddenly have a scene of Pat snoring really loudly in
Yeah.
bed. They didn't even share the same bedroom,
Yeah.
but they just created this situational comedic scene that
Right.
had just had me on the floor.
Right.
I also loved the scene. It was set to music, not to dialogue, of when Michelle Williams was taking down the Bobby Sherman
Oh, yeah.
pinup pictures and putting up the Richard Nixon pinup pictures, because her new teen idol was Richard Nixon, not Bobby Sherman. I just was rolling on the floor. I mean,
Right.
that was just, to me, that was just so hilarious. The last scene is iconic. I think that's probably the scene people who even haven't seen the movie remember.
Yeah.
But when Nixon is leaving town on the helicopter, and the girls go up to the rooftop of I guess Kirsten Dunst's house, and they're in these roller skating bikini get-ups, and they unfurl the banner with an important comma, "You suck, comma, Dick." And Nixon sees it, and then he gives them the middle finger. I just thought that was a great way to almost end the movie.
All right. My other favorite scene is the girls. Kirsten Dunst's brother is about to be inducted into about to be drafted, and
Which I think would have been historically inaccurate by
right.
then.
We've talked about this before. Yes. At that point, we were in college. You and I were both draft eligible for the year that they ended the draft in 1972. So
Right.
yeah,
They weren't calling, they still had, they may have even still had the lottery, but they were no longer calling anybody up.
they totally had the lottery. My number came in as 24.
And mine was bad too.
Yeah. So if Nixon had waited one more year to end the draft, you and I would have been drafted. But so anyway, all of a sudden they get politically aware, and so they decide to go in to talk to Nixon, and they sit down in front of the Oval. They sit down in front of him in the Oval Office, and they say to him, "War is not healthy for children and other living things." So, and Nixon has to pretend like this is a serious comment. But it's kind of hilarious because people used to actually say that. And
Well, it was a poster. It was also a famous
right.
poster.
And they used to take that seriously. It's like this extremely gratuitously inane, overly obvious statement. Like that's supposed to be a serious argument. And of course, it reminds me, I'm going to get political here for a second, but it reminds me of Greta Thunberg, you know, who's all this environmental global warming person that they take her seriously. And then you probably remember this example of Samantha Smith, this 12-year-old girl who wrote this letter
Yes,
to Kirby and Andropov in 1982. He was the head of the Soviet Union then, and she was a huge media star because she wrote this letter to Andropov about the need for peace. And anyway, in this particular,
she tragically died too.
I know.
It was terrible.
All right.
She and her father.
Yeah, I know.
In a plane crash.
All right. Well, thanks for bringing this down.
Yeah.
But the thing that's extra hilarious about the scene is when Nixon's aides come in and they get pissed that she's like that they're these girls are advising Nixon on policy, and they get mad, and Kissinger says it wasn't a war we started, and Haldeman becomes so upset that he has to be pushed out yelling, "If you have a problem with Vietnam, talk to Johnson." That's what like that's exactly what they would have said, but to say it to girl, like to try and engage these girls in a serious discussion is like ridiculous. So have you any more scenes you want to talk?
No, just some lines.
All right, what's your line?
Well, one of my favorites was Rosemary Woods, when the girls came back from walking the dog and
That's right.
said that he had pooped, and she just looks down her nose and says, "The president's dog does not poop. He does his business."
Right.
Thought that was a funny one. And then a more serious one, but funny and ironic, was when, I can't remember which of the girls, but at the end, when they're very self-satisfied for themselves at getting rid of Nixon.
Oh, right.
And they said, "It will be different now. They'll never lie to us again."
Right.
What a great line, considering the many, many, many lies that have been told to us by presidents of both parties ever since.
Right. One of my favorite lines is only a favorite line to me because it's an inside joke between the two of us, where Nixon says to the girls, "Don't worry your pretty little head about it." That's a Dallas line that used to quote to me all the time. So I laughed about that. I also thought what was funny was all I asked for was a simple bugging, which I mentioned before. Woodward says to the girls in the garage, "How old are you?" And they say 23. And he says, "Is that your combined age?" No need to be snotty. And then both times, they made dick jokes, and I laughed at them both times, like, because what's going on is they're having this conversation. All of a sudden people get quiet, And so Arlene's yelling, they're having this fight at the roller rink, and all of a sudden the music stops and she yells, "I love Dick." And everyone looks at her, and then at the Lincoln Memorial, the same thing happens where Betsy yells to Arlene, "You can't let Dick run your life." So
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our PG content today. But you're right; those are hilarious. And how
it's
can
just
you
stupid. Yeah.
how can you not make jokes, based on the various usages of that word? By the way, I never focused on why are people named Richard called Dick,
I don't know. Do you?
and I looked it up, and I
Okay.
don't know if it's true or not.
This is the
But it
research
actually
that people are paying for good dollars for. So let's hear it.
exactly. I actually looked it up, and I'm racing through my notes to find it. But basically, it was during the Middle Ages, and they first came up with something that rhymed. So Richard would be Rich
Right.
or Rick,
Right.
and then eventually it metamorphosed with no particular rhyme or reason into Dick. And the same with Robert and Rob and then Bob. And that's the most I could find on it. But we are left forevermore with the fact that people named Richard, who are called Dick, are going to have various comments made about them or to them throughout their life, aren't they?
Well, it's an interesting thing that that particular organ has so many names for it. And like,
Well, this must be why LBJ wanted to be called LBJ and not Johnson.
well, I was going to say, if your name is Dick Johnson, you're doubly cursed there. Okay. Yes. Moving on. What about, well, I think we've actually talked about the relevance or comparisons to politics and society today. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Only that I wish people could get a sense of humor again
Right.
about presidents they hate. Maybe in our next lives, we will see Dick like movies made about Donald Trump, but everybody's too up on their high horse and moral dungeon about Trump, and I'm sure about Biden on the other side. I wish people would recover their sense of humor about politics. I see a few signs of it now and then, but not many.
Okay. Could this movie be made today?
No,
No.
there'd
Um,
be too much political incorrectness, and you were even further removed from all the insider jokes about Watergate and the insider culture about the 70s. So I don't think so.
yeah, even when they made this movie, they tried to pitch it to a teen audience, which is wouldn't work because the movie is based on, as you said, about 25-year-old references to Watergate, and now it's 50-year-old. So no. And the other thing is, I don't think they could afford the soundtrack. I mean, the rights for those songs,
Yeah, I didn't think of that.
they're so much more expensive now than they were then. So yeah, so I don't think it could be made. What's your grade for the movie?
Well, I was in a real quandary because I truly enjoyed it and I laughed a lot, but I say B plus. And the reason it's not an A um, is it did have that TV improv Saturday Night Live skit like quality to me, from the cold open Saturday Night Live
Yeah.
cold open that we had in this movie with Woodward and Bernstein. And I'm not a huge fan of comedies anyway on film. So it just didn't quite make the A or A minus grade to me, but I'd certainly recommend it to anybody in our cohort or even considerably younger. It's a fun movie.
Yeah, I actually would give it an A. Comedies are actually hard because you have to hit the mark consistently throughout an hour and a half to 2 hours. And I thought they sustained the humor throughout the whole thing. It didn't get tiresome. They kept the plot moving. And as I said, the girls were sympathetic. They were not figures of ridicule. They were legitimately funny as 15-year-olds. So I thought I liked it all the way through. And as I said, it's still both Meg and I watched it and we both laughed. And then when I watched it the second time, I laughed again during the director's commentary. So if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
Now here I'll do a switcheroo and say yes. I think it would earn me some bona fides for coolness with younger people. I think my perception is that younger people are curious and interested in what prior generations of their cohorts were like. And I think they would be really curious and interested in the music. And I would show it alongside, maybe a lecture about to help them get some of the inside jokes. What about you?
I would do it as well. I would show it as well. The way I would do it is that right. I'd probably give the lecture and all the rest, and I would ask the students to watch it and then to research, do a research paper, what's real, what's not, and that would be a good way for them to dig in to find out like what the period was like. So I would definitely do it. All right. Have we beat this enough to a dead horse?
It is a recommended film.
Is a recommended film. That's right.
You will like it.
We will not do another Nixon movie for at least 3 or 4 because we got to
Oh, come on.
gotta give the people something else. We have plenty of Nixon movies to do, but we won't do them right away. All right. So I would once again say that this podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. If you are listening to this because I sent you the link, please subscribe, and you listen to it there. I have tried to create a celluloid president Facebook page, and every time I update it, they refuse to let me update it. I've violated some sort of Facebook guidelines, which I can't figure out how to do. So I don't know. We'll keep at it. I'm going to keep trying to figure out the Facebook page. But you can send me comments at garyholmes76@gmail.com. or you can tweet me at Gary Holmes. So I've really enjoyed doing this, Jim. I think this is maybe the only comedy we'll be doing. So we'll go back to dead seriousness next time.
Well, I don't know if the Elvis and Nixon movie is a comedy or not, because I haven't seen it. We probably want to wait since Elvis movies get shut out in the Academy Awards and maybe in podcasts. So maybe we'll wait a while on that. But isn't that a comedy?
I don't know. I'm sure it's
Yeah.
I'm sure it's funny because again, it's so absurd,
Well, you'll probably find Oliver Stone's JFK assassination movie a comedy too.
I've heard that the George Bush movie, Oliver Stone George Bush movie, George W. Bush is what's considered to be a comedy.
Yeah, there are some humorous scenes in that. In fact, I think it opens up with him sitting on the toilet.
Okay, well that's
TMI.
That's hilarious. All right. Well, with that high culture reference, and I'm glad we both got those American studies majors to analyze American culture in great detail, that kind of insight. So we'll say goodbye and see you next time at the Celluloid President.